Did you know that being a woman in medieval times was basically walking through a spiritual minefield? Could you have survived the intense religious scrutiny that medieval women faced daily? Ever wonder why so many women were accused of dancing with the devil? Medieval Europe had a serious witch problem, or at least they thought they did. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft, and a shocking 75 to 85% of them were women. But why women? The connection between women and witchcraft wasn't random. In medieval minds, women were considered more susceptible to demonic influence. The influential 1487 witch-hunting manual Malleus Maleficarum, literally the Hammer of Witches, specifically targeted women, claiming they were more carnal than men and therefore more likely to succumb to the devil's temptations. The authors, two Dominican friars, didn't hold back, writing that all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. Women who lived alone were particularly vulnerable to accusations. Widows, spinsters, and especially midwives, or women with knowledge of herbal medicine, found themselves in dangerous territory. A woman who knew how to ease pain during childbirth or treat illnesses with plants could easily be rebranded as someone using dark magic. One woman's healing touch was another cleric's demonic pact. The signs of witchcraft were conveniently vague. Did your cows suddenly stop giving milk after an argument with the old woman down the lane? Witchcraft. Did a storm destroy crops after a woman refused a beggar? Clearly, witchcraft. Even having a pet, particularly a cat, especially a black one, could be damning evidence. The tests for determining witchcraft were equally problematic. There was the infamous swimming test, where suspected witches were bound and thrown into water. The logic? Pure witches would float, rejected by the pure water, while innocent women would sink. Talk about a lose-lose situation. Then there was the searching for a witch's mark. Any unusual mole, birthmark, or skin tag could be considered evidence of where a familiar spirit fed off the witch's blood. One of the most famous cases was that of Agnes Waterhouse, England's first woman executed for witchcraft in 1566. Her crime, allegedly using her cat, named Satan, to kill livestock and make a neighbor ill. The evidence: her own confused confession after intense interrogation and her daughter's testimony against her. The fear was so real that even family bonds couldn't withstand the pressure of witch accusations. Number 2. Sexual transgressions. Was your medieval dress showing too much ankle? Could the way you smiled at the baker be interpreted as lust? Medieval society was obsessed with female sexuality, specifically with controlling it. Women's bodies were considered both dangerous and weak, dangerous in their ability to tempt men, and weak in their supposed inability to control their own desires. This contradictory view led to some seriously strict policing of female behavior. The medieval church viewed sex as a necessary evil, tolerable only within marriage, and primarily for procreation. Women who expressed sexuality outside these narrow parameters faced serious consequences. Adultery was technically a sin for both genders, but the punishment rarely fell equally. When Geoffrey, a man from 14th century France, was caught in an affair with Agnes, a married woman, guess who received the harsher punishment? Agnes was paraded through town, banished, and lost all property rights. Geoffrey paid a fine. This double standard was painfully common throughout medieval Europe. Even within marriage, sexuality was heavily regulated. Church authorities prescribed when couples could and couldn't have sex. During menstruation, pregnancy, the 40 days of Lent, Advent, Pentecost, certain feast days, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, sexual relations were forbidden. That didn't leave many opportunities. Women who initiated sex even with their husbands could be considered unnaturally lustful. For unwed women, the stakes were even higher. Pregnancy outside marriage was difficult to hide and impossible to deny. In 1320, Cecilia Madeleine of Oxford was brought before church courts for fornication. Her punishment included 6 public whippings around the church and marketplace, a physical and social pain designed to make an example of her. Prostitution existed in a strange gray area. While considered sinful, many medieval towns tolerated regulated prostitution as a necessary evil to protect respectable women from male desire. Yet the women working in these tolerated brothels were still marked as sinful, often required to wear distinctive clothing or badges, and barred from various rites. In 1351, a London ordinance commanded prostitutes to wear striped hoods to distinguish them from respectable women, a literal scarlet letter of sorts. Even women's clothing was scrutinized for signs of sexual impropriety. Sumptuary laws regulated who could wear what, often targeting women specifically. In 14th century Florence, a woman could be reported to authorities for wearing a dress too low-cut or with sleeves too tight. The punishment: public shame and hefty fines. Perhaps most disturbing were the cases where women were accused of sexual sin after being victimized. Court records from medieval England show numerous cases where women who reported rape were instead accused of fornication when they couldn't prove the assault occurred against their will. The burden of proof was nearly impossible. Medieval law often required physical evidence of resistance and immediate reporting of the crime. Number 3. Gossiping and loose talk. Ever heard the phrase, "loose lips sink ships"? In medieval times, they could sink a woman's reputation, or worse. Women's speech was considered a dangerous thing, needing careful monitoring and frequent correction. The very word gossip has revealing origins. It comes from God Sib, meaning godparent or close friend. By the late medieval period, it had evolved to specifically refer to women who talked together, particularly midwives and women attending births. Eventually, it took on its current meaning of idle talk or rumors, revealing how deeply female conversation was distrusted. Several medieval writings specifically condemn women's speech. The influential Book of the Knight of the Tower, a 14th century guide for young noblewomen, warned repeatedly about the dangers of speaking too much or too freely. The author counseled that women should speak little and wisely, as excessive talking would lead to sin. This wasn't just social advice, it was spiritual guidance backed by religious authority. Church officials had particular concerns about women discussing religious matters. When Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century English mystic, spoke openly about her religious visions, she faced constant suspicion and accusations. Male religious figures could be prophets. Women with similar claims were more likely to be labeled heretics or possessed. Kemp was brought to trial multiple times for her outspoken religious views. The medieval period also saw the development of specific punishments for women deemed too talkative. The most infamous was the scold's bridle or branks, a metal contraption fitted over a woman's head with a piece that went into her mouth to prevent speech. Public humiliation was the goal. Women forced to wear these devices were often paraded through town as a warning to others. Court records from medieval England reveal numerous cases of women charged with being a common scold, essentially a public nuisance due to excessive or malicious talk. In 1373, Joan Cook was presented at a London court as a common scold and disturber of the peace. Her punishment, being placed on the cucking stool, a chair attached to a lever, and dunked repeatedly in a river or pond. Even in private spaces, women's speech could be policed. Husbands were considered responsible for controlling their wives' tongues, and a man with a verbally unruly wife might face social ridicule. The popular image of the henpecked husband emerges from this period, suggesting a man who failed in his duty to maintain proper household hierarchy. Particularly dangerous was any speech perceived as magical. Blessing and cursing were taken very seriously, and a woman's angry words following a misfortune could be interpreted as evidence of witchcraft. When Ellen Nichols' neighbor's cow died shortly after she had quarreled with him in 1582, her angry words during their argument were presented as evidence of her supernatural malice. Perhaps most interesting is how these medieval attitudes about women's speech have lingered in our language. Terms like old wives' tales, to dismiss unscientific beliefs, gossip as trivial talk, and phrases like chatty as a magpie all reflect the continued association between problematic speech and femininity that began in medieval times. Number 4. Pride and vanity. Did that medieval noblewoman really need such an elaborate headdress? Was the merchant's wife's new golden brooch feeding her vanity and corrupting her soul? In medieval Europe, a woman's appearance wasn't just a matter of fashion, it was a moral battlefield. Pride was considered the original and most serious of the 7 deadly sins, and women were thought particularly susceptible to its manifestation as vanity. Medieval religious texts frequently warned women against excessive attention to their appearance. One 13th century French sermon collection compared women who dyed their hair or applied makeup to someone presuming to improve upon God's work, essentially accusing them of blasphemy through beauty routines. Cosmetics were particularly problematic in religious eyes. When Lady Alice Kivett of 15th century England was listed in her church's registry as using the devil's cosmetics, it wasn't just social disapproval. It suggested actual demonic influence. Church authorities condemned face paint, hair dye, and other beauty enhancers as attempts to create a false image and potentially lure men into sin. Even the styles of clothing and accessories women chose carried moral weight. The horned headdresses popular among noble ladies in the 15th century were particularly condemned by religious authorities, who associated them with devil's horns. In 1429, Friar Thomas Connecty became famous for fiery sermons against these fashionable headpieces, allegedly convincing women to throw them into bonfires on the spot. Sumptuary laws, regulations dictating who could wear what, were ostensibly about maintaining social hierarchy, but they disproportionately targeted women's clothing. In 14th century Florence, these laws specified the exact number of buttons a woman could have on her sleeves, and how much jewelry she could wear based on her husband's social status. Breaking these rules brought fines and public shame. Mirrors themselves became symbols of female vanity. Medieval art frequently depicted the sin of pride as a woman gazing at herself in a mirror. When wealthy women owned mirrors, expensive items at the time, moralists warned about spiritual dangers. Religious writers like Vincent of Beauvais described the mirror as a potential portal for demonic influence when used with vain intent. Hair was another focus of moral attention. Long flowing hair on unmarried women was acceptable, though still potentially dangerous in its allure. But married women were expected to keep their hair covered with veils, wimples, or headdresses. A married woman with uncovered hair in public could face church censure for immodesty and pride. The contradiction women faced was nearly impossible to navigate. Appearing unkempt or dirty could suggest sloth, another deadly sin, but too much attention to appearance indicated pride. Lower-class women with simple attire might avoid accusations of vanity, but could be criticized for not properly maintaining their appearance according to their station. Interestingly, some medieval women found ways to use these expectations to their advantage. When medieval mystic and later Saint Catherine of Siena wanted to avoid an arranged marriage, she cut off her hair and damaged her appearance, actions her parents interpreted as signs of religious devotion rather than rebellion, effectively ending marriage negotiation. Perhaps most telling is the story of Pope Joan, a medieval legend about a woman who supposedly disguised herself as a man and was elected pope in the 9th century. While historians consider this story fictional, its popularity reveals medieval anxieties about women's ambition and appearance. According to the legend, Joan's true sex was only discovered when she gave birth during a papal procession, the ultimate proof that a woman's body would eventually betray attempts at inappropriate social climbing. Number 5. Disobedience and insubordination. Ever wondered what happened to medieval women who didn't know their place? How did society treat a woman who challenged her husband's authority or questioned religious doctrine? Medieval society was firmly hierarchical, with everyone expected to respect and obey those above them in the social structure. For women, this meant submission to fathers, husbands, brothers, male religious authorities, and essentially all men of equal or higher social status. Challenging this order wasn't just rude, it was sinful. The biblical basis for female submission was frequently cited by medieval authorities. The story of Eve's creation from Adam's rib and her role in the fall provided theological justification for women's subordinate position. Popular medieval sermons reference St. Paul's instruction that wives should submit to their husbands in everything, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 24, as divine commandment rather than cultural custom. Marriage ceremonies made the expectation explicit. The wife's vow to love, honor, and obey wasn't just a formality. It was considered a sacred promise. Church courts could, and did, adjudicate cases where husbands claimed their wives were disobedient. In 1375, John Raven brought his wife Agnes before an ecclesiastical court in Ely, England, complaining she was rebellious and disobedient. The court ordered her to obey and please her husband in all things, not contrary to the law of God. Physical discipline for disobedient wives was not just permitted, but sometimes encouraged. The infamous rule of thumb allegedly originated in this period, referring to a husband's right to beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb. While this specific origin is disputed by historians, legal and religious texts did grant men the right to reasonably chastise their wives. Thomas Aquinas, the influential 13th century theologian, wrote that a wife should be subject to chastisement by her husband. The concept of female disobedience extended beyond the household. Women who spoke against church teachings faced accusations of heresy, a far more dangerous charge than simple rudeness. When Marguerite Porete, a 14th century French mystic, continued teaching and distributing her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, after being ordered to stop by church authorities, she was burned at the stake in 1310. Her crime was less about the content of her work and more about her refusal to submit to ecclesiastical authority. Even noble and royal women weren't exempt from these expectations, though they had more power than their lower-class counterparts. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, was imprisoned for 15 years by her husband, King Henry II, partly for supporting their son's rebellion against him. Despite her royal status, her perceived disloyalty to her husband justified her confinement. The concept of the shrew, a disobedient, argumentative wife, became a stock character in medieval literature and life. Communities developed rituals to shame men who couldn't control their wives, suggesting that female disobedience reflected poorly on masculine authority. In some European towns, a man with an unruly wife might be forced to ride backward on a donkey through the streets while holding its tail, a public humiliation for failing to maintain proper household order. Some women found subtle ways to exercise agency, while appearing to remain within the bounds of proper submission. Court records reveal cases like that of Cecily Champagnes, who in 1347 claimed she couldn't pay a fine because her husband controlled all their money. Was this true financial dependence, or a clever use of the system's own logic to avoid punishment? The boundaries between genuine compliance and strategic performance of submission were often blurred. The ideal of the obedient woman was so entrenched that stories of female saints often emphasized their submission, even as they took extraordinary actions. Catherine of Siena advised popes and played a role in ending the Western Schism, yet her hagiographers emphasized her humility and obedience to justify her unusual public role. Female power had to be carefully framed to avoid accusations of inappropriate ambition or rebellion against proper authority. Is it any wonder that many women internalize these expectations, believing their own thoughts and desires to be potential pathways to sin? How many brilliant female minds were silenced by fear of being labeled disobedient or insubordinate during these centuries? Were you born in the wrong historical period